immediately establishing central control and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. Instantly igniting a fight for central squares and creating asymmetrical pawn structures, the Sicilian defense immediately injects complexity and imbalance into the game. Immediately contesting the center with a knight, preparing for a rapid pawn push and potential queenside expansion. Proactively contesting the center, this immediately aims to shatter white's potential pawn phalanx and grant the bishop more freedom. Preparing a kingside fianchetto can unlock powerful diagonals for your bishop, aiming for eventual queenside pressure. Developing the knight towards the center supports the pawn structure and prepares for further central expansion. Unlocking the long diagonal for the bishop, this move prepares to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially disrupt their central pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside dark squares now, black prepares to fianchetto their bishop, aiming for a long-term pawn chain structure and potential kingside pressure. Solidifying the pawn chain offers central influence and prepares for potential kingside castling, creating a robust pawn structure. Developing the bishop fianchetto solidifies the long diagonal, eyeing white's kingside potential. Opening the F-file immediately signals aggressive intentions, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed black king and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure for dynamic play. Building the queenside pawn chain now, black prepares to develop the light-squared bishop to a more active diagonal while subtly contesting white's central ambitions and potentially supporting a future A5 push. Developing the knight to F3 supports the central pawn push and prepares kingside castling, while also preventing immediate pressure on the E4 square. Establishing active piece play, black repositions the bishop to a diagonal that pressures white's center and prepares for potential pawn thrusts. This knight's sortie to C3, although seemingly active, now finds its central influence slightly diminished by black's development, creating interesting imbalances. A thoughtful retreat, the bishop now eyes the long diagonal, hinting at future strategic aims beyond mere development. This positional maneuver seeks to solidify black's pawn structure, while simultaneously opening avenues for piece coordination. By placing the bishop on B7, black elegantly contests the light squares and prepares for a more robust queenside presence. A king secured and ready for counterplay, solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing the way for further development or a central pawn thrust. Positioning the queen for potential queenside castling or as a defensive piece, the move seeks to connect the rooks and prepare for a more active role later in the game. Instilling central control, this bishop repositions to enhance pressure on the long diagonal, a silent sentinel preparing for future pawn pushes or knight maneuvers towards the kingside. Black's ambitious pawn thrust disrupts white's comfortable kingside setup, aiming to seize central space and open lines for future action. Consolidating queenside control and preparing a potential kingside pawn storm. Shifting the knight to F6 aims to secure the E4 pawn and prepare for a potential E5 pawn break, building central influence. This repositioning also indirectly supports the G7 bishop, creating a more robust kingside defensive structure against white's aggressive pawn push on F4. Shifting the monarch to safety behind the pawn shield, a prophylactic maneuver against potential diagonal pressure or a future kingside attack, also clearing the G1 square for potential rook activation along the G-file. Embracing the shadows, black boldly commits their king to the queenside, transforming a potential defensive sanctuary into an attacking launching pad, while simultaneously exposing their monarch to the burgeoning threats lurking on the open files. Bolstering the central pawn structure and activating the rook along the semi-open E-file, this maneuver prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs while simultaneously enhancing defensive coverage around the king's nascent shelter. Securing the king's departure from the D-file's potential threat, this repositioning prioritizes safety over immediate central engagement, acknowledging the potential for dynamic play developing around the open lines. Receding from the center, the bishop retreats, a concession of central space, but perhaps aiming to solidify the kingside and prepare for a potential pawn storm with the G-pawn and F-pawn. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, might be a subtle attempt to create a more harmonious defensive structure against Black's queenside expansion, avoiding immediate tactical skirmishes and prioritizing long-term positional development. Observe how this repositioning could influence the future tension on the d3-g6 diagonal, and potentially redefine the role of the bishop in the subsequent middle game battle. Embracing the exchange, Black liberates the e-file, a potentially double-edged decision that invites confrontation and alters the central landscape by dissolving pawn tension. Opening the d-file immediately addresses the recent pawn exchange, aiming to activate the queen's rook and potentially exploit the now less defended kingside. The bishop's redeployment to the queenside outpost, aka Ba6, immediately challenges White's centralized pawn structure by creating a diagonal pin across the d3-g6 axis and pressuring the newly opened c4 square. This subtle maneuver aims to disrupt White's harmonious pawn chains and offers Black improved counterplay on the queenside, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses for the defender to exploit later. Unleashing a knight to a central outpost, White seizes the initiative and probes for weaknesses in Black's pawn structure, creating a dynamic tension that could lead to an early attack on the kingside or a beneficial exchange of pieces. Exchanging the bishop for the knight here seems like a concession of central control, potentially opening a long-term diagonal for White's queen, but it also removes a key defender from Black's kingside, and crucially, it simplifies the position, which may favor Black if they can outmaneuver White's slightly more cramped pieces. Reclaiming the bishop immediately solidifies control of the crucial light squares and prepares for an assertive central pawn push. Reactivating the rook to the open e-file, this maneuver aims to challenge White's central control and prepare for potential pawn pushes, aiming to unravel the current pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the White king. Disrupting Black's intended queenside play, the bishop pivots to eye the weak b6 pawn and potentially exploit the open b-file should it arise. Instantly altering the central landscape, this aggressive pawn thrust aims to break open lines and challenge White's seemingly solid pawn chain, potentially creating imbalances that Black can exploit. Seizing the open file, White initiates a dramatic pawn exchange that significantly alters the board's landscape, creating immediate tactical possibilities while simultaneously offering Black a chance to consolidate. Reclaiming the open file, the rook establishes its dominance on e5, injecting immediate tension into the center and challenging White's pawn structure. Clearing the diagonal for the queen's influence creates a dynamic situation, potentially opening lines for attack while simplifying the central structure. The queen's repositioning to c6 effectively untangles the piece, immediately creating a crucial diagonal threat against White's exposed kingside, while simultaneously preparing to contest control of the newly opened c-file. Unleashing a knight into the enemy camp, this move probes for immediate weaknesses near the vulnerable Black king and disrupts Black's pawn structure, forcing a reaction while simultaneously reinforcing White's central control. The rooks are finally finding their central purpose after a rather passive start, aiming to exploit the now open e-file and create active pressure on White's position. Unleashing a tactical dagger, the knight's capture on e5 fundamentally alters the queenside pawn structure, opening a critical diagonal for White's bishop and creating immediate pressure on Black's rook. Exchanging the rook for the knight resolves a potentially awkward pin and opens a pathway for your remaining pieces to become more active on the kingside. Pressing the advantage on the kingside, this maneuver targets the potentially vulnerable Black king by opening lines and threatening to exploit weakened pawn structures. Black's queenside expansion, 22, b5, aims to generate counterplay and challenge White's central control, though it potentially weakens the pawn chain's integrity. This bold queenside thrust initiates a battle for space and seeks to disrupt White's harmonious piece placement, particularly targeting the light squares that White's bishop on g2 has influenced. It's a strategic gamble, asking White how they intend to address the new attacking prospects on the flank while their king remains somewhat exposed. The move forces a decision. Will White continue their aggressive central intentions, Or will they be compelled to react to this flank initiative, potentially leading to a simplification that could favor either side depending on subsequent exchanges and king's safety? The tension now shifts, as black opens up potential avenues for their rook and bishop to become more active participants in the unfolding drama. Expanding queenside control with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's piece coordination and potentially create weaknesses on the b5 square, a move that simultaneously prepares for potential pawn advances like b4 while also providing a subtle shield for the king. Pushing the b-pawn here attempts to disrupt white's queenside structure and create open lines for black's pieces, aiming for a more dynamic and less passive position after the recent exchanges, though it does weaken the queenside pawns and might invite counterplay on that flank if white can consolidate. Opening the a-file aggressively sacrifices the pawn to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure, aiming for rapid activation of the rook and potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. Unleashing a sharp tactical blow, black seizes the opportunity to shatter white's pawn structure on the queenside, opening crucial lines for immediate counterplay. Seizing the open file on the queenside, the bishop now casts a watchful eye over black's fragmented pawn structure and prepares to exploit the weakness on c6. Challenging the pawn structure with a direct attack on the king's defenders, this bishop sacrifice aims to disrupt white's coordination and seize the initiative on the queenside.